Um, 3 years on, Ibrahim Traoré and the Burkina Faso crossroads. Yidupal. It was early morning in Ouagadougou when the quiet tension of a nation poised for change first registered. The sun climbed over red clay rooftops, illuminating dusty streets and tireless merchants, all beneath a sky that now felt full of watching possibility. Nearly 3 years had passed since Captain Ibrahim Traoré, fresh from a dramatic 2022 coup, assumed the presidency. He was 37, charismatic, relentless about a vision rooted in Pan-African unity and independence. Yet questions swirled. Was this a democratic rebirth or a strongman's rule in disguise? Western press framed the question as a paradox. A leader named for revolutionary ideals, now leaning on foreign power, state-led economics, and bold nationalism. And while headlines shaped global curiosity, those on the ground endured real hardships and unexpected improvements in equal measure. What came first? The promise of hope? The pull of economic survival? Or the fear of losing democratic freedom? The Russian alignment. When Traoré announced the departure from France and cultivated relationships with Russia, reactions ranged from cautious interest to alarm. Russian military advisors began working openly in Ouagadougou. Reports confirmed a paramilitary brigade deployed near volatile border areas, hard evidence that Burkina Faso's private reformation plans now carried geopolitical weight. Despite the alarm, Traoré's message was different. The past, he said, was a burden. France, he argued, had left a society tailored to its own needs, an education system, language policy, trade laws while siphoning resources. He famously remarked, "If you want to build your nation, you must first be free from who decides your price." The Russia pivot enabled dramatic economic policy shifts. Mining laws were overhauled. Every foreign firm must offer the government 15% equity and institute local training programs. That translated into gold companies surrendering shares to the state, younger scientists hired for core operations, and workers trained in extraction, refining, and oversight. Within months, Nord Gold, a Russian company, received its major license. Burkina Faso's first domestic gold refinery was built from the ground up. For the country's first time, national mineral reserves were being stockpiled, an economic signal of sovereignty few could ignore. Local wins. Local investment responded in kind. Factories reopened. Coca-Cola quietly re-entered the market. Small-scale industries refreshed production lines. People on the ground reported new jobs, new factories, and rising optimism. Students pursuing technical degrees at universities looked to the mines as potential employers. 3 years ago, no one thought gold in our land would benefit us, said Amina, a 23-year-old geology student. Now I'm studying for a job that's my country's, not someone else's. But optimism wasn't universal. Capitol Hill in Ouagadougou said that while promising, higher productivity required stability. Mining needed roads, power, rule of law. Some of those foundations were only starting to take shape. Economic fractures beneath the glow, foreign firms retreat. As the new laws took hold, tension rippled through global investment circles. Queensland-based Sarama Resources launched arbitration against the government after losing a mining permit. A London-listed gold producer watched 2 concessions slip from their portfolio. The broader message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer open to passive resource extraction. It demanded return, control, and visible benefits. The foreign response was equally audible. Lawsuits, legal delays, bureaucratic freeze. Investment plunged in 2024. Mining firms on annual conference call lists began marking Burkina Faso high risk. The shift in alignment toward Russia amplified uncertainty for firms tied to Western financing. Even internal government sources estimated that foreign capital dropped 30 plans 40%. While infrastructure investments continued with loans from Russia and China, these soft financing deals came with strings and strained relations with the West. Budget crunch, security tension, economic woes converged with national instability. More than half of the national budget was devoted to security. Insurgent activity from extremist groups in the north and west had intensified. Government troops clashed daily, and sporadic bombings had forced many communities to flee. Tepaski, normally a joyous festival, became clouded by fear. Streets in Ouagadougou remained crowded, as families, once celebrating in their hometowns, chose to stay in safer zones. Those who did stay spoke softly about villages lost and loved ones at risk. "We stayed because it felt safer here than walking towards the unknown," said Ibrahim, a displaced farmer and recent father. For the government, security was expensive and complex. Roads needed patrolling, communities needed protection, and the economy needed breathing space. But diverting resources away from education, healthcare, and agriculture carried its own price. Promises deferred. In May 2024, Traoré's government published a 5-year plan to transition back to democratic governance, national elections, party registration, a rejuvenated media landscape. Headlines in foreign papers called it a roadmap to redemption. Yet 18 months passed with no political activity, no dates set, no campaigns organized. Political reporters asked, but got bureaucratic references to security priorities and fragile progress. Journalists added new lines to their reporting. Still awaiting political application became a stock phrase in tracking notes. Commentators started to ask, was this a calculated pause or observant crackdown? Press Underwatch. Mo Sani Aliou of Channels Television described his experience like this. "I checked in with the National Communications Council as required, but waited almost a week for acknowledgement. And yes, I realized early on I had a minder on my tail. They kept tabs on my hotel movements and warned me against negative reporting." Other journalists told similar stories. Delayed license renewals, held for questioning, warnings of coverage that touched upon destabilizing commentary. Those were the mildest effects. Some noted internet throttling when posts went critical. Others found their NGO partner offices subject to surprise audits. Not overt censorship, but heavy-handed protocol. Some called it soft authoritarianism, a slowly closing space. Youth speak out. Before each peaceful campfire dialogue, students from local universities spoke to me in hushed tones. "We want our leaders accountable," said Gracien, 20. "We want elections, not just promises." "We're proud of techno jobs," said Kofi, working in the gold sector. "But we're even prouder when our voices can be heard." There was bitterness, but also determination. They saw opportunity and demanded participation. They believed in a generation-old prophecy. Without a democratic outlet, revolution becomes a necessity. Confrontations and discontent. Market day protest. On a brisk Tuesday morning in late 2000, 25,000s gathered in the central market area. Market vendors, university students, and ordinary citizens stood with banners reading, "Our gold, our voice, and we want dates, not delays." Security forces responded with restraint but also visibility. Unmarked patrol cars, lightly reinforced troops near government buildings. No violence erupted. Instead, a mayor came forward, pleading calm and promising urgent dialogue. This local protest marked a turning point. Discontent was moving from whispers to coordinated action, and it was peaceful. Oficial response. The government responded swiftly. Prime Minister Adama Ouedraogo appeared on national television, acknowledging that citizens were anxious to see democracy return. He promised that a process to register political parties would begin in 90 days, with elections scheduled within a year. It was the first public timeline offered. Media trends shift. Days later, national newspapers began offering coverage of civic hope and civic responsibility, with editorials supporting party registration and deadlines. There was cautious optimism, but still interruptions. One editor said, "We're hopeful, but we're not naive. We'll measure word by word, date by date." Nation in the balance. Diplomatic shifts. Foreign embassies grew active. The EU ambassador praised the proposed timeline. The UN envoy offered to help monitor a fair transition. African neighbors Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal sent delegations to discuss knowledge sharing and regional monitoring. Traoré welcomed the gestures but reminded audiences of autonomy. "We'll choose our time, not bend to pressure." Global press, Al Jazeera, BBC. Reuters now spoke of Burkina Faso as a case study in controlled reform. Radical economics, national security, democratic recalibration. The People's Watch. Communities waited. Town halls began springing up, led by NGOs and church groups, giving residents space to ask questions of local ministers. While imperfect, it showed civic agency. An Ouagadougou teacher named Nafissatou remarked, "Before, we talked around politicians. Now, they talk to us." Final reflections. As December 2025 arrived, the national gold refinery shipped its first major reserve, enough to stabilize financial reserves and pay down debt. Factories were turning profits again. Coca-Cola ads returned. The pulses of daily life, street lights, college exam schedules, taxi fares, now carried an extra nuance, potential. Yet the echoes of uncertainty remained. Would elections occur as promised? Would civil rights follow money and security? Would Russia's influence allow for independent elections? The world watched. So did Burkina Faso, aware, hopeful, cautious, but ready for the moment when the future would reveal itself. Epilogue: paths, yet unwritten. Ouagadougou at dusk looked different than it had 3 years ago. Street vendors closed, stands with fresh gold for fuel investments. Young engineers discussed digital innovations at cafes. Mothers wove hope into bedtime stories. Captain-turned-President Traoré stood facing a crowd on national broadcast and international livestream, welcoming dignitaries from neighboring nations to a regional summit celebrating economic cooperation and democratic potential. His speech briefly paused on the past. We have inherited a history of borrowed confidence and borrowed power, but we're building a future of ownership, of our resources, our institutions, and our voices. Then he turned to practical issues: funding for journalists, subsidies for displaced farmers, technical support for political parties. In that moment, he looked less like a coup leader and more like a sentinel guarding a fragile experiment. Final questions. Will elections happen as scheduled? Will the miners stay open? Will insurgents be contained? Will democracy, loud, messy, human, find a place in the capital's vertical civilization? For now, Traoré's story isn't one of victory or defeat. It's the story of a nation testing its resolve by balancing power and promises. And for the young voices in the streets, those demanding bread, ballots, and dignity, this is no time for heroes. It's time for citizens to step forward. 3 years on, Ibrahim Traoré and the Burkina Faso crossroads. Economic fractures. Beneath the glow, rain had softened the red clay roads outside Ouagadougou, turning them into ribbons of mud stretching toward the horizon. Inside the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré paced before a floor-to-ceiling map, his posture shaded by urgency. His earlier pivot toward Russia and newfound mineral control had unlocked possibilities, but now fissures were forming beneath the polished surface. The mining law overhaul had been bold. Every foreign concession now required 15% state equity and local training commitments. Within months, Nord Gold, a Russian-backed firm, had announced Burkina's first domestic gold refinery. It glinted with national intention, a promise that mineral wealth could fuel schools and hospitals, not distant boardrooms. Yet across the broader market, subtle alarms were ringing. Sarama Resources from Australia and a London-listed gold company had lost concessions and responded with arbitration. They began treating Ouagadougou as a risk-hot zone. Lawsuits followed, agreements frozen. The shift away from passive extraction was narrowing the path for Western capital. Inside the government, officials spoke in hushed urgency. External investors had dipped by 30–40% in 2024. Russia and China stepped in with financing soft, but heavy with expectations. Crests of newly paved highways and refinanced power plants came with subtle strings. Western embassies' growth rates slowed. Diplomatic cables veered cautious. IMF discussions stalled. Traoré stood before his council of ministers at dawn. He spoke with quiet conviction. We traded patronage for partnership. When those partnerships cost us our control, we must recalibrate. Sovereignty demands risk. Outside, worry flickered on the faces of ordinary Burkinabés. At a roadside cafe, Amina, the geology student, sipped milky coffee. We're proud of our refinery, she said, voice low. But what about our roads, or the schools in the north? Nearby, Ibrahim, the displaced farmer, tapped his cane fiercely. We still flee bombs and we still pay more for fuel. Traoré recognized the gulf. Economic ambition on one side, ground-level realities on the other. Budget crunch, security tension. The wind-blown grasslands of northern Burkina Faso, unmoved by grand speeches, had become a battlefield. Extremist insurgents returning, emboldened rained bombs and bullets across forgotten villages. Families fled beneath shockwaves and sorrow. The festival of Tapaski, once a joyous gathering of faith, became a muted caution as migrants flowed into safer towns. Fearful of attacks along barren roads, the government designated over half its budget to security. Armored vehicles rolled down inner-city streets. Soldiers patrolled checkpoints with heavy-caliber rifles. Air surveillance hovered above front lines. For many, stability meant survival. For others, it meant stagnation. Schools shuttered. Harvests abandoned. During one evening briefing, Traoré heard a minister's plea. Without education and health, the minister insisted, security is just tyranny with camouflage. Traoré listened. He knew the tension: balance investment in defense, avoid neglecting clinics and classrooms. The decisions looked good on paper. A power plant for Bobo Dioulasso, a road network bridging agricultural centers, and localized military outposts near insurgent zones. But funding was tight. Priorities clashed. The question loomed: which nation were they building first? The democratic question. On a breezy May afternoon in 2024, the presidential press room hummed with expectation. Traoré's 5-year roadmap toward democratic elections, party registration, media reforms, transitional governance felt like a turning of the tide. Headlines worldwide spun it as Burkina Faso's redemption arc. Capitol Hill, however, remained skeptical. 18 months later, no political parties were registered. No elections scheduled. Security remained the alibi. Journalists grew frustrated. Mo, Sani, Aliou spoke about having a minder trail him, while visa delays hit others. NGOs faced inspections. Internet throttling targeted critical posts. At university-led campfire dialogues in Ouagadougou, young voices sounded more urgent by the month. Under string lights, Gracienne, a second-year law student, spoke softly. We want accredited accountability, the system, not empty platitudes. Kofi, who audited the gold refinery's training programs, added, economic change without civic representation is still a kind of colonization. It was true technology and opportunity did not guarantee participation or freedom. Many feared that Traoré, once the people's champion, was increasingly giving in to executive comfort, confrontations, and discontent. On a cool Tuesday morning in late 2025, Ouagadougou's central market, usually a kaleidoscope of produce and chatter, turned into a stage for quiet revolt. Banners reading "Our gold, our voice, and we want dates," not delays, rose above rows of stalls. Students from the university passed out flyers, party platforms, civic engagement guides, contact lists for political registration. Nearby, unmarked tactical vehicles circled. Uniformed but untagged soldiers stood at strategic points outside government buildings. No batons, no tear gas, just a reminder. We're watching. Amid the crowd, a local mayor stepped onto a soapbox. We call for calm dialogue, he said. But the demand is real. We want your voices heard on your terms. His reassurance sounded sincere. Within hours, Traoré's ministers formed a delegation and met citizen representatives in an improvised market pavilion. That evening, Prime Minister Adama Ouedraogo spoke on national television. Party registration would begin in 90 days, elections slated within a year. The announcement sparked a wary optimism. Media outlets began to shift tone. Editorials leaned forward, saying, now we measure progress by actions. Village-level committees formed discussion circles. Young teachers like Nafissatou, who had once taught from under a tree, watched as ministers stepped down from air-conditioned limousines to face questions about curriculum reform. Open, she said. Like windows we haven't seen before. Nation in the balance. Diplomats returned to Burkina Faso in cautious solidarity. The EU ambassador lauded the timeline. The UN envoy drafted support logistics. Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal circulated delegates and monitoring teams. Traoré publicly thanked them, but emphasized one point. The hour of our democracy is ours to define. International media began recasting the story. Not a failed coup, but controlled reform, an uneasy hybrid between radical economics and nascent democracy. On the ground, NGOs launched town hall circuits. People embroidered their concerns into the civic process, focused less on ideology and more on issues: clean water, fair representation, power stability. We want solutions, they said, not slogans. Economic reality, human complexity. As December 2025 drew near, economic signals strengthened. The gold refinery loaded its first official export, and government coffers saw relief. Debt payments were scheduled. Factories hummed again. Coca-Cola trucks glowed along widened avenues. Taxi drivers smiled. Students texted late-night code projects. Citizens felt, tangibly, that their lives were shifting. Yet uncertainty remained in the air. Would campaigns unfold or stall in procedural limbo? Would civil liberties press freedom, NGO operations, internet openness, live up to pledges? Western power brokers lingered Russia's influence both shield and shackle. Intelligence briefings questioned insurgent resilience as violence still flickered in borderlands. Traoré spoke in a dimmed summit hall, face half-lit by satellite button screens. Youth activists watched online. Elders made notes. The world leaned in. Paths yet unwritten. Dusk settled over Ouagadougou. Street lamps glowed against terracotta rooftops. Vendors closed stands that once rang with chatter. Now they talked softly about gold-backed fuel reserves. Digital entrepreneurs tinkered at caf tables. Mothers sang bedtime songs woven with hope for ballots and futures. Traoré stepped onto the summit stage, hosting regional leaders, and addressed the crowd. We inherited borrowed confidence, borrowed power. Now we own our resources, our institutions, and our voices. He pivoted. Journalists received funding. Displaced farmers got subsidies. Political parties got support. In that moment, he looked less like a coup architect and more like a caretaker of fragile trust. Still, questions hung in the half-light. Will elections truly happen? Will the mines sustain jobs and not just sparkle on reports? Will insurgents be contained without sacrificing law and rights? Will messy democracy claim a seat in Burkina's tight political tapestry? Burkina Faso's story was no headline victory or scandalous downfall. It was a national experiment, a balancing act between power and promise. The pulse of markets, the vigilance of citizens, the resolve of a young leader all coalesced into a living question. What does it take to forge a future built not on foreign terms, but homegrown trust? For those demanding bread, bullets, ballots, and dignity, the path toward ownership had already begun. And this time, the call for heroes was replaced by one for citizens to step forward. The precipice of promise. The dry season in Burkina Faso stripped the land of color. Dust cloaked every surface from ministerial balconies to village window panes. In the capital, anticipation mixed with fatigue. The electoral clock had begun ticking, and with it came the slow, grinding weight of expectation. In Ouagadougou's northern neighborhoods, you could hear election jingles played through dented loudspeakers tied to bicycles. Bright murals began appearing, depictions of ballot boxes, women casting votes, children drawing national flags. It was as though the entire city had been waiting to exhale for years. At the heart of the Electoral Commission, tall stacks of documents signaled registration drives underway. Paper met digital in imperfect harmony. Traoré's Transitional Council insisted the timeline was on track. A nationwide voter ID effort, candidate vetting, and free press guarantees. Foreign observers were invited. Radio stations reopened, cautiously airing debates between youth candidates and civil society organizers. Yet the ghost of authoritarian delay loomed large. One morning in January 2026, Prime Minister Ouedraogo stood before Parliament newly expanded to include transitional civil figures. He declared, "Our commitment is not to perfection, but to process. Our institutions are seedlings. Protect them with patience." But outside the glass dome, things felt more brittle. The youth coalition Burkina Vote 2026, led by 27-year-old organizer Alassane Koita, staged a silent march. They held signs that read, "Deadline is democracy, not a suggestion." Their message was clear. Optimism was earned, not assumed. Embers in the north. In the Sahel provinces of Soum and Oudalan, the mirage of progress didn't reflect on scorched earth. The insurgency, never fully extinguished, adapted. It no longer aimed to hold territory, but to sabotage the legitimacy of the state itself. Roadside bombs were replaced by whispers, rumors that voting booths would be attacked, that civil registrars were spies. A schoolteacher in Djibo, Mariam Diallo, taught arithmetic while scanning the horizon. Armed men had torched ballot boxes in a nearby village. Her brother, once a mid-ranking commander in the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, VDP, had vanished. Some claimed he joined an extremist splinter cell. Others believed he'd fled the country after witnessing corruption inside the auxiliary forces. Traoré's response was multi-pronged. He deployed fusion units, blended teams of army, VDP, and gendarmes, trained not only to fight, but to restore administrative outposts. Clinics were reopened with mobile units. Voter education materials were airdropped by drone. The effort was costly. In a fiscal update, defense spending surged again, now 56% of the national budget. Critics saw a deeper contradiction. Can a vote held under siege ever be truly free? Still, the rural response was not entirely fear. In a video that went viral, elders in Goram formed a human chain around a community polling station chanting, "You take our water, our cattle, but not our voice." It became a rallying cry, echoing through cafes, churches, and WhatsApp groups nationwide. Shifting sands of foreign policy. As election banners fluttered across Burkina Faso, foreign embassies adjusted their calculus. The West, once skeptical of Traoré's geopolitical orientation, saw glimmers of pragmatism. Russia's influence remained dominant, but not exclusive. In March 2026, Traoré made headlines by hosting a tri-continent summit in Bobo-Dioulasso. Flags from the African Union, the BRICS bloc, and EU delegations stood awkwardly side by side. The theme, sovereignty through multipolar partnership. In a moment that captured the complexity of Traoré's diplomacy, he stood beside China's trade envoy and France's agriculture minister and declared, "We welcome all who build with, not over us." Analysts noted a shift. Chinese road projects were paused pending environmental review. A French-funded solar farm in Kaya resumed construction. Russian military advisors were still visible, but the Defense Ministry also began informal talks with ECOWAS on insurgent containment. The international community, hungry for stability in the Sahel, began to reconsider its posture. IMF talks resumed. The African Development Bank quietly increased its soft loan portfolio. The U.S. Embassy announced scholarship programs for political science and journalism, a subtle nod toward rebuilding trust. But in the streets, the message was sharper. One graffiti tag sprayed on a downtown wall read, "Don't trade one puppet for 5. The return of opposition. With registration opened, old political ghosts returned, some rebranded, others resurrected. Among them was Seydou Sanfo, a former interior minister turned reformist who launched the Unity and Renewal Party. At his rally in Koudougou, he opened with, "I do not oppose Traoré, the man. I oppose Traoré, the monopoly." Sanfo's platform leaned heavily on rebuilding civic institutions, reducing military spending, and negotiating a new national charter based on multi-party federalism. The youth gravitated toward his candor. Elsewhere, Gracienne Yarrow, the law student from earlier protests, shocked many by announcing her candidacy for a regional parliamentary seat. She ran as an independent, backed by student associations and labor unions. Her slogan was simple, "From protest to proposal." Traoré himself declared he would not run for president. Yet speculation persisted. Would he anoint a successor? Would a military-aligned candidate emerge? Some believed the real plan was governance from behind the curtain. In response, an editorial from La Faso Libre asked bluntly, "If the captain steps back but still holds the compass, is the ship truly free?" Campaigns and crossroads. By mid-2026, campaign season turned chaotic. In some areas, rallies resembled music festivals. In others, intimidation resurfaced. The National Electoral Commission fielded 1,200 complaints in one-month voter intimidation, suspicious disqualifications, missing ballots. One troubling trend was security zoning. Military designated no-go zones where election activities were banned. Officials insisted it was for safety. Activists argued it disenfranchised the North. Traoré took to national television, addressing the chaos. "We inherited ruins and planted seeds. Now that they bloom, some wish to trample the garden. I ask our people, let the process live. Still, concerns grew. NGOs like Civact and African Vote Watch released joint reports warning of a managed democracy where forms existed but function was constrained. The Burkina diaspora, allowed to vote remotely for the first time, injected further energy. Young professionals in Paris, Abidjan, and Atlanta formed digital caucuses, live streaming debates and fundraising for grassroots campaigns back home. In an unexpected move, Traoré agreed to a televised town hall. He fielded raw questions from miners, students, and displaced farmers. One young man asked, "You promised power to the people, but what if the people choose someone else?" Traoré paused. His reply was somber. "Then my service ends, but my country continues." Day of Reckoning, the 2nd of August, 2026. Election Day. Across Burkina Faso, polling stations opened with cautious ceremony. In the capital, lines snaked around schoolyards. In rural provinces, donkey carts and motorcycles ferried voters across dusty plains. Observers from the African Union and ECOWAS noted significant, but not disqualifying irregularities. Social media teemed with images. A grandmother voting for the first time, youth guarding ballot boxes, children handing out water to voters. In Dori, an insurgent-claimed area, elders performed a traditional blessing before the community voted, defiantly. In Ouagadougou, tech startups offered digital tracking of polling results, increasing transparency. The nation was electric with purpose. As night fell, provisional counts trickled in. No single party won outright. A coalition was needed. Sanfo's bloc led in urban centers. Independents dominated the student and diaspora vote. Military-aligned technocrats held rural strongholds. For the first time in years, Burkina Faso felt plural, loud, messy, democratic. After the storm, weeks after the election, as new parliamentarians were sworn in, Traoré stood quietly on the balcony of the presidential compound. Below, school children waved flags outside the parliament gates. A woman led a class chant, "We voted! We build!" He didn't smile. He looked tired but resolute. In a final televised address, he announced he would formally step down after the coalition government was confirmed. His words echoed not as triumph, but as transition. A revolution that ends in one man was never a revolution. Burkina belongs to its people, messy, wise, unfinished, and finally, heard. Across the country, the reactions were complex: relief, pride, skepticism. But one thing was certain. A door had opened wide enough for citizens, not saviors, to step through. 2A, 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 2A.